We are live and being recorded. So welcome to our online discussion. I am going to save instructions in case we do get other people that show up. But in the meantime, let me just talk a little bit about our network-centric resources project. This project helps resource developers understand how to develop people power and participatory resources and establish assets for networks and communities that share ownership, enable contribution, and support collaboration. We have just published a draft of a life cycle for network-centric resources. And I'll be asking for comments and getting people to look at that all just a little bit later in the discussion. What we are trying to do in this project is really drive home that a build it and they will come approach is likely to end up with unused and unloved content. And you need to be deliberate in engaging beneficiaries, communities, and networks in developing a resource together. This is the best way to ensure maximized usefulness and usage. To exemplify this, we are honored to have Soraya Okuda here today to share learnings from designing the Security Education Companion. And of course, I'm having troubles like doing two things at once. There is Rachel Wettinger joining us. Thank you very much, Rachel, for showing up today.
Hi, Rachel.
And Kristen Anton. You are more than welcome.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I'm late.
No worries. We were just getting rolling. And so I will actually now do the participant bit for you guys that you are here. So what you need to know about participating in the discussion today, firstly, do know that this is being recorded. It is being broadcast live right now on YouTube, and we're going to make this available for viewing just after we finish the discussion. So we do ask that you do stay on mute for the time being. However, you can use the chat room at any time to post questions and comments. To access that chat room, click the icon in the upper left-hand corner of the screen and feel free to type hello once you get there. I'm also posting a link to the Etherpad. Am I? Yes. In there. And in the Etherpad, you can feel free to type questions, but also take notes and help me do some documentation for a blog post that I will be putting together afterwards. I am even screwing up on the discussion right now. Oh, there it is. Here is the Etherpad. That's what I get for doing too many things at once. Anyways, so that said, like I said, I was just about to introduce Soraya. So totally glad that you guys showed up. So first of all, just to say hello, Soraya, and start us off, why don't you tell us about the problem that the Security Education Companion is trying to solve?
Hi, thanks for having me, Dirk, and thank you all for joining. So the Security Education Companion came out of a few different problems that we became aware of. One was after the 2016 elections, EFF and lots of organizations, like many people on the call know, saw this huge flood of training requests. People were asking basically us to fly to a given community, give a training, and then fly away. So there was this need. In addition, we were seeing a lot of requests from technologists who are eager to get involved to learn about how to teach digital security specifically, as well as from non-technical folks like myself who were eager to learn how to teach digital security to others and to teach to their communities because they were very concerned. So we saw these two problems and thought, okay, well, how do we not add to this problem of a community feeling unsupported after a training, but also give people resources for them to feel confident when teaching digital security and also get some not best, but better practices for teaching. So the companion came out of this long journey of figuring out how to tackle those two main problems.
So, and I mean, I think the piece in this is that EFF is already putting out materials like their surveillance self-defense kit manual, and that is something that has been like a tried and true resource for digital security folks. So in one aspect, curious in terms of, was there problems with trainers just picking up and using that from the get-go? Like how did this differentiate? How was it different from that?
Sure. So surveillance self-defense, as I see it, is a resource for individuals to learn on their own. So maybe they, are Googling like how to use Signal. They end up on the site, and then they realize, oh, this is translated in 13 other languages, and they share it with their friends, their family. It's something that they can read on their own, install a tool, be able to use the tool somewhat confidently, and then close the interaction. What we were finding was that people were using surveillance self-defense in trainings beyond their own self-learning. So printing out the whole guides, sharing these with participants. And, frankly, it's not an ideal use case for this type of resource because it's very nuanced in its language. It's not something meant for a short interaction. It's something that someone really needs to sit with. So we thought, okay, well, it seems like there needs to be some guidance for actually how to teach the underlying concepts in SSD, and the companion came out of that.
So tell me more about that process. Like, how did you figure out how to learn how to do that, to create the companion?
Sure. So we used human-centered design methods. So it's a very small team, myself and basically another colleague who was interested in helping me with gathering research. But we developed about 20 questions and decided we need to speak to lots of trainers and see what's already happening, what they're already teaching. Is a resource actually something that they want? Is a trainer's hub, which is like what the phrase we were using at first, something that's desired in the space? And, would this actually help the US training scene? Would this help people that are trying to teach the communities that they're in the United States? So we went around, asked those 20 questions, which included what's the starting point for a training? Do you use learning objectives? What tools do you tend to teach? If you don't teach tools, what do you do instead? And tried to find some common themes. We spoke to lots of people at conferences, people doing trainings. We ourselves were doing awareness raising events and small workshops and, kind of reflecting on our findings and how people were learning. So once we identified common themes and common problems, we sat with it a bit and went, oh, okay, it seems like people really need resources that guide them, for example, toward teaching a beginner audience. And we ended up narrowing from these discussions to two main user groups, one being a beginner audience of trainers who maybe are less experienced with teaching, but very technically proficient. So folks who need maybe more guidance with not scaring participants, for example, not having judgment about operating systems. And then another user group, which was, more toward people who are very interested in digital security, but who don't yet feel confident in their technical skills or knowledge. So these were two main groups that also kind of emerged, not just in our problem phase, but also as we were talking to people. So we focused in on these two and eventually came to this language of not just teaching communities, but teaching friends and neighbors specifically. We wanted people to feel like this is something that they can do. We wanted to push them toward groups that they already knew, as opposed to communities that aren't their own. And also to feel, more confident, getting some practice, watching other trainings, seeing things that are actually happening and realizing that they're not in isolation. They're part of a larger group of people who is doing this work.
Cool. I mean, I think one of the things that, is so critical with trying to get people engaged in just training is that bit around confidence, right? And trying to instill that bit in terms of it's in some ways, when you're doing a training, it's okay for you to also be learning as you're doing the training, right, and figuring it out, and helping a community move forward. But curious in that, in getting in, how much of this would you characterize towards co-creation? Like how much of there was that of back and forth and sort of looking at how people were using it, and particularly new trainers, like how much were you able to get them to inform you in terms of content and what the materials needed to look like?
Very much, especially in the early stages. For example, so my background a little bit is that I'm a designer. I studied education. I was working, for example, on slideshows, and I had like really comprehensive slides filled with GIFs, filled with like all these interfaces of how, someone might use something like PGP. And, showing these to people early on and realizing, oh, not only are people not going to use these slides, even though at first they may say they want them, but like actually using these things in practice, they can't, they have to find their own voice with it. It's hard to like try to figure out how to use someone else's like materials. It needs to be something that's a lot more straightforward. So it was a series of like iterating, like going from, like this idea of like, oh, we're going to have slides, to instead being like, oh, that doesn't seem to work at all. Let's look at handouts. Let's look at like very short interactions where we know participants are having trouble focusing. And so sharing these handouts with trainers and having like a small group of people who have agreed to help give me feedback on them and to co-design on them, and identify if there are areas that don't quite make sense. And, me making changes or telling, the team some areas that we found that just didn't align with our initial assumptions.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, but just give a heads up warning to Rachel and Kristen. I'll pause in a moment and let you guys ask some questions if you have any. But the thing I'm really curious about with that thing of getting input and having, well, I guess the big thing is, like, I know with organizations, you've got timelines, right? And things are supposed to be delivered at certain times. So how difficult was it with you working within EFF to be a little bit more flexible and being more agile and sort of putting these materials together and getting them, moving the ship forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The honest answer is that it's kind of messy, even for us as a somewhat larger nonprofit. It was messy. My luck was that I had a good team of people that could help me with, prioritizing working on this project, and that I, was able to like use, some of the design software myself and make these changes somewhat rapidly and hopefully like just push them back to the testers and to use them myself as someone doing these awareness raising events. But overall, it's tricky to balance the timeline portion with really wanting to do the good work of researching and like really talking to the people that you're trying to reach. Like we, for example, spent a lot of time speaking to trainers. Like a good few months of the project was spent just talking to people and just challenging our assumptions of what we thought we wanted to make. And, not everybody has that kind of luxury in their project flow, but they should still advocate for it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, and some of those assumptions might be, is the resource needed, and having to go back and go, okay, well, is this actually needed? Right. But that, that's really, really important thing, that having those existential crises, right?
Yeah.
But then, I mean, but then you have all these layers, like in terms of the funders and all of that, that have to sort of absorb the shifting timeline, right? Because I see Kristen, I know your mic's working well, so let me get you to come off mute and ask your question.
Okay, I just had like a bunch of questions.
Ask any. Go ahead.
I need to. Okay. I'm wondering. Well, the question that I posted was how long this project actually took you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Just out of curiosity, out of my own curiosity, because if I wanted to start a project like this, how long did it take?
Yeah, it took about a year, which for a curriculum is, to be honest, fairly short, but for a website, it errs on the longer side. So it was challenging because we, at the same time as like the beginning stages of this project, we're also trying to figure out our own training strategies internally. We had a group of people that do awareness raising events, who do workshops on digital security, that we're trying to figure out how to be better teachers. So in some ways, it was kind of self-serving because we were talking to our own colleagues who wanted to learn how to become better digital security teachers. So that helped us to think about it a little bit earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, that's impressive. 1 year, that's great. And for each of these pieces of content, is it still living? Is like, I'm thinking, now I'm thinking back to what Dirk recently posted about the resource life cycle, and I'm wondering if there's a certain status that you would say that this is now at?
That's a great question, and let me actually pull up Dirk's blog post. I would say that we are in the birth (launch) phase. Okay. We have just pushed out this project. We're still kind of figuring out how people understand it, and it is a living resource. So personally, my stake in it, for example, is that I designed all the handouts. One thing I have in mind is like, okay, how are people actually using it in classrooms and libraries and workshops more generally in these public spaces? Like, are they printing them out? Are they having trouble explaining a given concept to a learner? Is there anything in particular that's still like, you know, really hard for beginners to understand? Is that a fault of the design, or is that a fault of maybe the way the lesson plan is framed? If so, like, we can make changes to it. And so trying to collect this really specific feedback and working on it and fixing it is in the long-term plan.
Amazing. Okay, I just have one more question, Dirk, if that's okay.
It's more than fine.
Can you say a little more about like the nitty-gritty stuff that happened behind the scenes? I'm wondering if, I mean, I know you had a very small team. It was the two of you. Did you two have a pretty formal process for developing these resources? Like, first, we're going to have an initial draft, and then we are going to check in with this group of people, and next we will check in with this group of people, and then when we have the next draft, we're going to go back around to these other people. Was there anything like that? And also, like, what kinds of tools did you use to collaborate on these kinds of resources? And oh, and also I was curious, sorry, this is a lot. An idea just came to my mind that it would be kind of cool to share with the audience what the process was for developing these. And I wonder if EFF has done that.
Sure. Let me break it apart into separate questions. And then I should also make a correction. I didn't mean for it to sound as though it was just me and one other person. I actually had a whole group of people helping me, from web developers to a few other designers, and to like the curriculum team itself, which included my colleagues on the international team and the activism teams. But I was the one full-time person on this, so it really depended on like when people were able to spare a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know how that is.
So as far as the question of like what the process was, so I, for example, had experience with human-centered design before in education graduate school. We had used it as a methodology for creating instructional materials and for testing out whether people understood something. So it's a little bit different than maybe human-centered design used for something that's more of a product, or something that everyday people encounter without a learning goal in mind. So I was like really eager to bring this to EFF and to try it out, because I frankly don't think we had done it before. And so figuring out how exactly we could portion it in sort of as a test project was interesting. One thing that we had done was in the scoping phase, we had maybe, I want to say like 4 or 5 different versions of a project plan that changed dramatically by the end, as we learned more and more about what trainers are actually doing. But one phase was this research phase of like just going out, reading as many digital security materials and resources as we could, seeing how we could avoid being redundant, what a unique contribution to this space would be, and then just, you know, seeing what people are actually teaching. So that was like a whole huge chunk. Another part of it was, you know, as I was working on trainings or awareness raising events with my colleagues, actually testing these materials in the classroom. So going to these events, seeing learners super puzzled, realizing that I as a teacher had failed, and then just having to like take that material and fix it and make it better. That was another few months of just, you know, testing out these things before even feeling comfortable giving them to other groups. Then the next phase was also sharing what materials we did have with groups that had volunteered to give us thorough feedback. This was done in tandem with developing the website. So we had many meetings with designers going over like low fidelity designs, then high fidelity designs based on the project plan. So I'm actually realizing I'm missing a step before that. Sorry about that. There's even more. We developed like 15 to 20 different user personas too, based on all the people I had talked to and had observed at trainings. So they included 10 participant personas of who you might see in a classroom or in a library training setting, for example, and 10 personas of a trainer that we're trying to reach. And it could range from, you know, someone who's very inclined toward live hacking their participants to someone who's just really eager to share their knowledge. And we incorporated some inclusive design principles. So for example, the users that we had included as learners often had some type of disability or unique learning need that a trainer would have to consider. So after sharing all those user personas, you know, we, on one end, we're developing the site, we're designing the site, and on the curriculum development end, we were looking at these personas and had a bunch of different design sprints, writing sprints. We were prioritizing, okay, for this, you know, X participant, what kind of needs do they have? What kind of writing would help them to understand like the needs of a training group? For this type of, you know, persona, what kind of needs would this trainer have? And so a lot of the Security Education 101 articles came out of that kind of like writing sprint where we were thinking very specifically about examples of people, exact problems that they might have, and exact advice we could give that might reduce harm. So yeah, it starts to get messy in terms of explaining the process by this point, because we, you know, we're sort of like prioritizing different items in a curriculum based on how easy it would be for a beginner teacher to explain, how much nuance is required to be able to explain it well, explicit examples for each of these, common questions and answers someone might have for a given topic area. So that all was happening on the content development end. Meanwhile, getting the feedback still from the testing groups, making changes based on them. And then, you know, by November, when we felt that enough people had given us good feedback, we started to get ready for launch.
Great. I know there's another question that Kristen had that I'm going to ask you to pause on. But let me just get Rachel to come off of mute, because I think you've got a really good question for right now for what she's talking about.
Cool. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, Rachel.
Yay. Hi, everybody. I'm wondering, the term inclusive design is new to me as a term, though not new to me as a value, obviously. Do you have any tips for good places to start when you're building personas to include inclusive design principles?
Yeah, actually, I think Microsoft has a great inclusive design page. So they have a few examples of how they well, they've created like a few personas as examples. These aren't in the educational context; they're more in the product design context. But I think they're still helpful. One resource I personally have referred back to a lot is an educational resource called Accessing the General Curriculum, and that's by Nolet and McLaughlin. I think we referenced it in our like learning objectives piece on the Security Education 101 section. But basically, this is for inclusive education. So how do you include learners with disabilities in a classroom with mixed skill levels? And the idea is to be able to teach to everybody well at their own individual varying levels, considering various sensitivities, various ways that people might be unable to otherwise understand the work.
Cool. Actually, and thank you guys for Rachel for getting those links and putting them in the thing. I'm desperately trying to cut and paste them over into the Etherpad because I have a tendency to lose that chat room. But I did want you to riff just a little bit more on, because I know that when we were talking in prep for this conversation, you had mentioned some resources that you did find invaluable in the process that you had. So I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to talk about like what was really critical for you as resources for putting the companion together and helping you think through it.
Sure. There were quite a few. I mean, I just want to honor all the resources that are already out there because we were reading through them and just being like, wow, this is great. Like, what could we possibly do that would actually be additionally helpful to the community? One was Hack Blossom's feminist guides. I really love those. We referred back to Tactical Tech and like Holistic Security. We referred to a bunch of guides that are out there. Actually, I think on the credits page of the companion, you can see like a lot of like what influenced our early thoughts. But the resource that I mentioned earlier, Accessing the General Curriculum, was something that I kept falling back to, actually. The way that they center on learning objectives is really useful and thoughtful and gives lots of examples. And for me personally, I've found looking at inclusive education as one of the most inspirational forms of being able to create content well for diversity of learners. So I found myself looking back through that when I was struggling with how to organize the curriculum, when I was struggling with how to organize and group big ideas, when we were trying to narrow down on like what the most achievable skill sets were.
That's great.
Yeah.
Just curious too, in terms of the helping people understand how to be a good trainer. Has the Level Up aided stuff that has any of that been helpful?
Oh yeah, no, Level Up's been awesome. We have been referring back to Level Up throughout the resource actually. And we got very lucky. We had Carol Waters on as a contractor who also assisted really heavily with Level Up. And so she was able to contribute significant knowledge on that. AIDIDS has been helpful. I think that the general framing around problem solving has been kind of a universal, not just for adult learning, but student learning as well, and learning for kids. And so, being able to point back to some of the great activities that Level Up has that are really problem-centered, project-centered, I've found useful. And we're always trying to like link back to the great work that's already on there.
Well, actually, it's funny you brought that up in terms of the the framing for problem solving and all that, and its relevance beyond stuff. Because one of the things that I've found, like in trying to translate AIDIDS and the adult learning research and methodologies for a place like MozFest in Mozilla, where we've got like 600 different facilitators working on sessions for different age groups. One of the things that you know, I've come across in having engagement with trainers there is the stuff that comes up with AIDEDs is actually not just relevant for adults, but it's also how other age groups learn and all that. So we might need to be opening that up just a little bit more. But anyways, great. Super good, super helpful stuff. Kaustubh, I'm going to ask one more question. If you do have anything you want to ask, you are more than welcome. I know it looks like you've had some connection problems and you're coming and going, but I certainly want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So I'll come back to you in just a minute, just to give you a heads up warning, or why don't you if you do have a question, be sure to put something in the chat room there, and I'll make sure to call up on you. One thing I want to make sure, we've got Lucas's question that we were looking at earlier, and just to clarify that for the listeners, let's see, Lucas Kroll has written in case he missed the conversation, and it looks like he is missing it. First of all, I hope that I will be able to join the discussion, but I'm afraid that I might arrive with a bit of delay. Okay, that was that. I would, however, love to hear your views on when, if ever, perfect becomes the enemy of the good. I know that some information security experts have recommended against teaching PGP and also Tor, arguing that they are difficult to set up, demotivate potential learners, and that it is easy to get things wrong when using them. When is it a good idea to teach about, quote, advanced tools such as PGP and Tor, and when is it better to ignore them in favor of telling people to go for simpler solutions such as using Signal? Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. We struggled with this ourselves, figuring out whether, to prioritize including a lesson module for Tor and for PGP, which down the line it'll be there. But one thing would be to evaluate the threat models of the groups. Sometimes this becomes apparent during a training where you realize someone's far more at risk than the rest of the people present, and in which case it makes sense to pull them aside rather than teach to the whole group. And, just giving them a heads up that it's going to take a few hours to learn this stuff well. In my view, teaching these things that are very specific tools with really unique use cases and constraints and specific multiple ways to screw it up requires the time for a learner to actually understand, try out the tool, see the ideal use cases, and then to also be cautioned about the areas they might mess up.
Yeah, I think, sorry. No, I was going to say, I think the thing that my fallback is always if the information is really putting lives at risks, and really critical, and you don't have a good, secure method of putting it online, you just can't put it online. And in cases of PGP and Tor, what is really valuable for people to understand on a non-technical level is the concepts, right? So understanding that concept around encryption is really critical. Understanding how Tor hides your identity is much more, in some ways, much more important than actually learning how to actually physically use it. If you can get your head around encryption and that thing of the keys, that's really valuable.
I think that's exactly right. So much of this could just be broken down into okay, could this participant learn Signal and a VPN perhaps? Or, could they learn any of the more usable existing tools? Does that adequately accomplish their need? If not, going into, okay, well, how am I putting them in harm's way by also teaching them this tool?
Yeah.
Is me teaching this tool potentially going to put them in danger if they use it incorrectly? Yeah. And if you're willing to accept that risk, just being sure that you're transparent about how much time it's going to take them to learn it.
Great. Rachel, you've got a great meta question in the chat room. So let me get you to come off mute and ask that question.
Thanks, Dirk. First, I'll ask what is not a tiny question. That's a follow-up to the thing you're just talking about. I'm deep in trying to figure out what's basic curriculum on a different subject and what's advanced. So I wonder if you have any thoughts. It feels related to the question you were just asking about how to decide what's basic and advanced.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, it depends on what is being taught. In the case of digital security work, so often it's tied to big concepts, which maybe a learner is impatient on, and also tools that they're more excited about. And so it has these overlapping concerns of like usability and good design for the tools that do exist to, you know, like if these tools are like quite advanced and have lots of different ways to use them, such as Tor browser, just understanding how many levels of knowledge there are for the thing that they'll be learning. One thing that's been helpful for me for assessing whether something is more basic or advanced is just trying to narrow down learning objectives. I think writing them out and having concrete, like one sentence, like someone would be able to do this, and like it being an attainable thing, and seeing how many of those come up really can be humbling and make you reassess, oh, that's actually far harder than I thought it was.
That's
Great.
a really good question. Answer, sorry.
Good. Do you have more, Rachel?
Sure, if there's time. I have a totally meta question, which I think is the one you were asking about, Dirk. Soraya, what signals help you know that you're doing a good job of listening to the network's needs? Or how do you know to do a better job? Like, can you talk about your gut on this stuff a little bit?
Oh, that's a good question. That's also hard for me to answer. Yeah, I mean, I think the key point is to try to be an active listener, and that can be sometimes challenging and sometimes quite painful. Because on the positive end, you know, maybe you hear people are like very candid about what frustrates them and welcoming that and going like, no, like this actually helps me. Hearing like how this is failing you is actually helping me. And also on the other, being a sensitive artist type and just being like, oh man, I worked on this thing and it's like not good enough. But just making it clear that it's an iterative process and that's okay. And that's what you're aiming for. That helps quite a bit.
And actually, to follow that up, Kristen had an earlier question, which I think really applies to this. So Kristen, do you want to ask that?
Sorry, which question?
Sorry, how do you know when the content is ready to launch?
Oh yeah, that was my initial thought when you had read that question, Dirk, is the perfect versus the good. And for digital security, we could talk about it for weeks, that actual content. But I was thinking like to take a step back, and when do you actually know when content is ready to be published? How do you know that you've gotten enough feedback? I mean, that's a really hard question to answer. I kind of meant it as more like a hypothetical question, but if you have any thoughts on that, that would be great. And also, I haven't introduced myself yet. I apologize. This has been a really helpful presentation, so I really appreciate you doing this, Soraya. And my name is Kristen Anton. I'm the Director of Programs with Herodox. I've been with them for a couple years. Yeah. And my passion is to document our knowledge about information management and human rights documentation and the knowledge of our network and be able to share that in a really useful way. And we're only taking like little baby steps now.
And we are grateful that you are here, Kristen.
Yeah, no, so glad to have you. And I'm always happy to chat about this more with anybody that wants to afterward.
But getting back to this tension, so the initial question though, how do you know the content is ready to launch?
That's a great question. The honest answer is that sometimes like external pressure is helpful. I think there's a little bit of a tension between having perfectionist tendencies about curriculum and what is, you know, sufficient knowledge for someone to be able to like move forward. And also just going, well, you know, it's more helpful for this to be out there at this point, even at this stage. And as long as we're transparent that we're iterating on it and that it may have like a few problems and that we welcome feedback on those problems and it's okay, then, you know, I think it's ready to go. I think going back to like software development methodologies and saying like, yes, this is an iterative approach and we are making changes and we're going to make it better is kind of freeing for saying like, okay, I think it's good enough.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting too in terms of like when you're doing written content, we do have this tendency to like go, oh, it's perfect, and it's a final, right? And it's going out the door. And I think we lose a lot by not keeping that prototype frame on something for a while, or even the thing of versioning, right? So, you know, you get a version done, you learn, and then you get another version done and out the door. And even with text and content, that's a much more helpful and engaging way of getting things done and out the door.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, you know, getting trusted people to look at it, and also getting your intended audience to look at the materials before putting them out there is such a big step. We were able to show enough of these materials to folks that were just learning about the concepts themselves. And, you know, if someone said, oh, I don't get this, I don't understand that, for me, that would be a red flag that it wasn't ready at all. If someone didn't understand it or didn't feel like they could explain it to someone else, then it's certainly not ready for teaching.
There's another level of that I wanted to add on to that bit of like when something is perfect. The other issue that we have a lot with digital security content is that we learn like a particular tool is suddenly been compromised, right? And is not good to be using anymore. And I think that's another thing that we have a struggle with these things where we'll learn, you know, a tool is suddenly like not good to be used. And then what do you do? Right. And all that. So just wondering if you have any riffs on that.
Yeah, I mean, because of like how often tools seem to go out of date or a vulnerability is found, that actually influenced how we were writing a lot of our content, where we were trying to find more general ways to describe things. So we would refer to a tool in an example sense instead of as the definitive thing we recommend. Like, oh, if you are using an end-to-end encrypted communication app, such as Signal or WhatsApp, depending on your context. So a lot of like, you know, trying to find a way where we could explain the underlying concepts while share some commonalities between these tools, some commonalities in their designs, but not necessarily like focus on, you know, the product.
Yep. Very good. So listen, I think we've come to a good point in the discussion. So Kristen, thank you for mentioning the life cycles content and blog post that I put out. I'm just putting it in the chat so that you guys have it. So you know, that blog post I put out, I'm really trying to get this process down that, you know, Soraya's talked through a bit in terms of like, you know, how do you get to a place where you have a resource that people are using and is out there and all that good stuff, but then also to be thinking about the future in terms of, you know, where is it headed, and having an understanding of like when a resource might die, or, you know, when something might be reborn in another form or reused and modified. So trying to look at it in all the ways. Just wanted to ask you guys, while I've got you on and I have sort of a captive audience, if anybody had any good feedback on it for me right now. And also maybe just to get, Soraya, I know you had some thoughts in terms of, you know, you talking about where the Security Education Companion is right now in terms of the life cycle and where it's headed.
Yeah, sure. So as I'm looking through this post, yeah, the preconception and conception phases really map to the processes I described. You know, the whole thing of like drafting content, soliciting feedback, incorporating the feedback and revising it, really maps to what we've been doing. After the project's been launched, which is the birth phase, I think maps also to like what we're doing now, which we're figuring out our outreach plan. We're figuring out who's exactly using it. A lot of it's kind of informally found through who, you know, messages us or like tweets about SEC. You know, finding evaluation metrics, that's another one where we're still working out. For example, we've been doing user testing, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with user testing, but it's basically this process that kind of lets you have a person, a beginner, go through a website, explain out loud what they're seeing, having them complete a task, for example. Can you find teaching resources? And then as they're trying to find or complete that given task, they're talking aloud, they're saying things that they expected to see. If they didn't see those things, like what they had hoped to see, or why it surprised them, and just collecting that raw feedback. So that for like site design and site development is really useful, because we can see if, you know, it makes sense to someone who's outside of the community but wants to know where they, you know, landed in this virtual space, and understanding what they can find there. The other end of that is also just, you know, finding ways to gather feedback from trainers, which is a little trickier. So making sure people know that they can contact me directly or contact our feedback form, give, you know, hopefully specific pieces of feedback on, you know, how something was hard for someone to understand, or how it didn't work out in their teaching environment, and then iterating on it. So we're still kind of figuring out what to do post this birth phase. And I think like the infancy, youth, maturity, death, afterlife parts are like, you know, something I'm still kind of struggling to figure out myself.
Which is good. But it's also good to hear, I think, like that bit in terms of, you know, getting feedback and all that. Sometimes we have to be super proactive in terms of getting out and getting people to tell us stuff about how they're using it. And so it is really critical that you don't just put something out there and expect people to tell you both how they're using it and or how it's good and bad. You have to be really active in sort of monitoring usage, right? And looking at how it goes, and often we get surprised by the way that things get used. They're not often its initial intent, and it's always good to know that. So yeah, just curious though, Rachel, Kristen, if and Stub, even if you had any comments on the life cycle now for me.
Well, something that I just heard that really resonates with me is applying this idea of the agile approach to software development to resource development, like the iterations. And I love that. But what's completely different between resource development and code development is that a lot of the code is done in the open, and you can see the code on GitHub, and you can see the contributions, you can see the commits, you can see who's contributing and what they're contributing. But when it comes to resources, I don't think we've figured out a really good way of doing that yet. And that's something I'd be really interested to explore more. Does that make sense?
Agreed. Yeah, no, totally. I think, I mean, there's some, you know, there's bits. So what's interesting, I think, is there's bits in terms of this user-centered design stuff where, you know, we're taking stuff from software developers and sort of their methodologies for learning how to develop these things. One of the things that I think we are forgetting often when we are looking at these methodologies is that a lot of the stuff that the software developers have figured out, they've learned from community organizers, right? Mm-hmm. And like how you get people engaged for the long term, how you get them to tell you stuff, and how you like, you know, make sure that they become leaders and all those sorts of things. And I think, you know, we need to circle back even further to that community organizing things where you are really engaged in building leadership in terms of your resource, right? And I think, Soraya, you know, the Security Education Companion has a lot of potential for leadership development with these networks, right? So the people that are out there doing digital security in these things in the US are people that are, you know, learning how to resist, but also, you know, becoming leaders in their communities and all that. And the SEC is supporting them in doing that, right? So, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's a little further, right, than just the software development that we need to learn from. It's also that little further back in terms of the community organizing work.
I like that.
Cool.
Thumbs up.
Cool. No, I don't. So Rachel, sorry, come on off and ask that question.
I have some more comments about the draft too, especially because I'm like about to use it today to implement some stuff. But I ask in the chat if you have a blog post about software development's roots and relationship to organizing, because I would just love that to exist as a reference in the world.
I don't, but you know what? I'll add it to my list of blog posts and hit you up when I'm about to write it, so you can help me out. Cool.
I found Jono's book, The Art of Community, the O'Reilly book. I totally picked that up not with any understanding that it was a book about organizing open source communities. And I was like, art and community together, I will read this book. So I have that as a point of reference, but have been hungry for the thing that you're kind of more specifically pointing towards.
Well, actually, and I think the bit in terms of a book, right? There's a book called that we've been referencing a lot in another network that I'm on it called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. And I think that it'd be interesting to be doing a comparison of those two books. Because Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is the Bible for community organizing work. So
much criticized.
Yes.
So as usual, I have a kind of meta question about the life cycles draft. I'm engaged right now in building some network-centric resources for a very specific purpose in a very specific geography. But with the intention that we can learn some lessons from that process and then build resources that are more broadly applicable. So I'm envisioning a version of the lifecycle draft that includes a terrible shortcut way to say it, but local to global loops, or even worse, local to universal loops, but how to build things with the intention of recycling and scaling them into other contexts, basically.
Yes.
Super easy.
Well, yeah, no, but I think so. You're getting into the piece that is, should be kept in mind, and even with Security Education Companion, even things Level Up, Holistic Security, all these things in terms of you put content out in the world and then people start using it. One thing is to understand when it is not useful anymore. So when would it need to die? But then the other thing is, obviously there's other ways that it could be used. So how can you make content available for people to be, doing modifications in different ways so that it is, you're reusing and repurposing it. So one of the things that in terms of just the technical piece that I'm interested in is repositories like GitHub, and I think Adam Hyde is starting to build something with that the knowledge. I can't remember the name of the thing, the Knowledge Foundation thing that he's building. But what is a appropriate repository for text that people can reuse and rebuild? Maybe I didn't answer your question, Rachel, but you know what I mean? It's that bit of how do we build stuff, but then people don't have to reinvent the wheel. The content is there for them to pick up and quite easily start moving forward in a different direction with it.
Totally. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a specific answer, but I'm always excited to talk about how to do this thing.
Yeah, and also, and Stubb, you're raising this thing, June's thing on content as code. Is another iteration of that, and I'm constantly having this struggle between that thing. And actually, I've got a note into June because I want to talk to him some more, because I don't keep having that bit of and I think maybe Kristen, you've called on this a little bit earlier. Code is not content in some ways. If we're talking about the written word, sometimes that doesn't work. But, the very basic of this of having something that you can pick up and reuse easily, like code, is. Anyways, I'll argue against myself and waste everyone's time and confuse you more. But thank you for that. We are at the top of the hour, and it is the start of Soraya's day, and it is the end of mine. So do just want to say thank you to you guys so much. Soraya, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Rachel, Kristen, Stubb, thank you so much for your inputs. As I said, this will be made available immediately after I hit stop broadcasting, and will be available on YouTube. Thanks you guys for keeping up on the notes and stuff. This will also be a foundation for a blog post that I'll put out on the network list when it's finished in the next couple of days. That will also then include the video, all of this, so it can have wider distribution. We do seem to have some viewers, and so thank you to everyone who is watching the live broadcast as well. We hope this has been super informative. And with that, I'm going to hit the stop broadcast, and we will be done.
Thank you,
Thanks so much, Dirk.
Soraya.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.